A computer has so many parts, and we've already learned about so many of them. But what's keeping all of these parts together, and what is the main reason that these different components can talk to each other? Because your computer is more than just a jumble of these parts in a metal cage or an aluminum cage. These things have been specifically organized for maximum efficiency. Let's hop right into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Vic the Random. Today, we are talking about the motherboard and what it does in the computer. You've probably heard about the motherboard quite a lot, and it is the motherboard. Nothing else would quite possibly be able to exist and work in such efficiency without the motherboard. So, without further ado, let's get going. Oh wait, quote of the week first. Hello everybody and welcome to today's quote of the week. There is no one giant step that does it. It's a lot of little steps. Peter Cohen. And one thing that I'd say is, hop right in. Alright, let's get started with a quick review on what we've done so far. I will be linking a Google Drive document that includes everything we've learned about before today, and that will basically just be a quick refresher. But here's another one. CPU. Central Processing Unit. This does most of the main computing in your computer. It takes all of the inputs that you may have, the click of a mouse, and it decodes what these inputs might actually be. It also actually communicates between the memory to pull up what is necessary and display it on your screen, along with the GPU, which is number 2, which is the graphics processing unit. This unit actually takes what you want to put onto the screen and graphs it out. Now we have HDD and SSD. These are the long-term, non-volatile storage systems. These store your files for a very, very long time, and even if you turn off your computer, they still stay. Then, of course, there's the RAM, there's the memory, and this is essentially what stores all of the stuff on your computer that you want to be able to access really, really quickly. When you open up a new video game, stuff from the SSD moves to the RAM so you can quickly load up those fresh new graphics. Alright, we've talked about all of this, and we will later on be going through a full-on, in-depth review of how these different chips relate to each other and work together once we learn them all. But right now, we are talking about the motherboard. And the motherboard is the part of the computer that connects everything together. It connects the CPU with the GPU and the CPU with the memory. So let's talk a little bit about the motherboard. Now, the motherboard is the piece that connects all of these different things together. It connects the CPU with GPU and the CPU with the memory so that they can communicate with each other. Only, how do these things actually communicate with each other? Remember that computers store the data using ones and zeros. That's how the data is stored on the SSDs and the HDDs. However, how does this information get transferred? How do these ones and zeros get transferred from the storage to the RAM? Well, once again, it is using electricity. If we draw a wire from the storage, the SSD, to the RAM, we can see that the storage can actually send information to the RAM using pulses of electricity. Pulse of electricity, one little pulse of electricity, is a 1. If there is no pulse of electricity, that's a 0. And as these pulses and lack of pulses go from the storage to the memory, you have the string of ones and zeros that is transferred from the RAM or from the storage to the RAM. And the fact that this is using electricity means that this data, this storage to RAM, this transfer of information is really, really, really fast. I've only talked a little bit about it before, but this transfer from storage to RAM can take milliseconds. For larger files, it can take a second, but we are at the point right now where SSDs can actually output files at 1 gigabyte every single second. That is insanely fast. Now, now that we have these wires and whatnot, let's just keep on adding these wires. Let's go from the CPU to the GPU, and from the CPU to the RAM, and the storage to the RAM, and the storage to the GPU, and the storage to the CPU, and then the RAM to the GPU, and the... Oh god, that's a lot of cables. And in fact, this is how they used to do it. Old computers used to have large wires running between each component. And that's why a lot of these old computers took up entire rooms, because it was not very space efficient to have giant cables running from one component to another and to all the other components as well. In fact, if you take a look at the backside of a TV from the 1900s, you will see tons of wires, tons of really messy wires on the back. But today, you don't see tons of wires in your phone or in your computer or in your iPad. How do we actually do it now? Well, today, instead of using massive jumbles of wire, we use something called a circuit board. And a circuit board replaces those wires with neat printed lines of copper. Let's go through the steps. First, you start with a fiberglass plate. Now you add copper to that fiberglass plate. The copper will be acting like our wire, but this time it's a very thin sheet of copper that is applied to the fiberglass. Now you etch a pattern onto the copper, and that pattern is going to be the pattern of your lines. Now if you treat that copper with UV light and then wash off the copper, there will be certain parts of the copper that actually stay. And guess what? That's the exact same pattern as the pattern that you wanted your lines, or we call them traces, to be. And these copper lines are really thin, and they don't take up a lot of space like the wires. It's like, imagine having to drive a giant truck from your house to your friend's house, but you don't actually have any roads. So you're weaving between other people's houses, you're trying to avoid bumping into other cars. That was the mess it was before. But now with this copper strips, we've designed roads, and we've made much smaller cars, and also much faster cars as well. And in fact, these days, rather than having one strip or one plate of the circuit board, we actually stack multiple of these copper roads on top of each other, which further shrinks the amount of space needed. Because instead of having one giant plate, you have a bunch of smaller plates that are stacked up on top of each other. And that actually is what makes our devices able to be so small. You have so much stuff inside your phone. Think about your phone. You have so much stuff inside of it. But because you no longer need these wires and you just have these small, not necessarily printed out, but like etched out, somewhere in between etched out and printed out circuit boards, you can have a device so small. And this essentially just allows different chips to talk with each other. And isn't that cool? This is really late for intermission music, but yeah. Hello everybody. Once again, if you enjoy my podcast, I do really hope you enjoy it. Just share it with a friend and you can spread the word. But anyways, hello everybody and welcome to today's random fact generator. It's been a while since 3D printing first evolved, but 3D printing I think is personally really cool. You essentially take a bunch of plastic and you melt it down. Then you can build small layers and slowly stack up those small layers to make something 3D. For example, if you wanted to make a 3D printed moose, you could start at the very bottom and print the moose layer by layer up and up and up until you get a 3D printed moose. I just think that's so cool. And there are so many new innovations. 3D printing is so much faster than it was when it first came out. And I just think that's really cool. We've talked quite a bit about actually what the motherboard is and how it was made, but what does the motherboard essentially actually do? So once again, the motherboard houses the CPU, the GPU, the SSD, and the memory. And if you actually decide to build your own PC and you buy a motherboard, you will see slots on it for you to put all of these different parts. Now remember, the CPU does the main processing. So when you plug in all the parts in the motherboard, these wires that or these copper lines and roads and traces that we just talked about allow the CPU to talk to the storage and control that flow of data. However, the motherboard actually has its own chip for processing its own stuff. Why though, you might be wondering? Well, you can't just plug a camera or a USB drive into your computer and hope that the computer just knows what the camera is. The motherboard doesn't just hold the CPU, the GPU, and the SSD. It also holds a bunch of different plugs that you can plug into your computer. These days, a lot of computers don't have as many plugs as they used to, but the motherboard still holds that plug. If you plug in a charging cable into your computer, the motherboard has a chip that calculates, oh, hey, look, I am getting electricity. I'm just gonna make sure that electricity goes to the places it needs to go without making sure that my computer burns up. Or maybe even like, oh, hey, this computer is getting rather hot right now. I'm just gonna turn on the fans and let it cool down. And it does stuff like that, as well as if you want to plug in a microphone into your computer, like how I'm recording right now, the motherboard will sense that, hey, I'm receiving audio from this microphone, and it will accurately send it to the right place. And in fact, when computers were first built, there were a lot of chips to control different things. If you wanted, there was a chip to control the keyboard. There was a chip to control the sound. There was a chip to control the CPU and to control the directions that the storage gives to the RAM. And another chip to control the sound system. And another chip to control the power. And another chip to... So many different chips. And this was actually really, really messy. So remember, just think about it. Having a CPU and a GPU communicate with each other is already complex enough, but now you have all of these extra chips. So eventually we moved to condensing all of these chips together. So they took all of these different chips and they condensed these chips into two chips, the North Bridge and the South Bridge. And the North Bridge is the north or the upper part of or it's also called the northern part, but it's the upper part of the motherboard, and it actually manages the data transfers between the CPU, the memory, and the SSD. So if the CPU wanted to tell the storage something, it would have to go through the North Bridge and then to the memory. Now, if there's a North Bridge, there's also a South Bridge, which is on the bottom part of the motherboard. And the South Bridge would manage all of the peripheral ports. So if you think about the fans, if you think about the electricity, the microphones and the cameras, and so on and so forth. However, as technology has advanced, we've actually gotten rid of the North Bridge on many modern-day motherboards. The CPU does the job of the North Bridge now. The CPU automatically just connects with the memory or with the GPU or with the SSD. So now that we've gotten rid of the North Bridge, when you buy a motherboard, you actually only get one part. You have one chipset or one platform controller hub, which controls all of the extra appliances like the power, the camera, the microphone, and all of the external stuff. But yeah, that's essentially just a quick overview on what the motherboard does. It's very, very interesting, and in fact, next week we will be talking about USB ports and how essentially they work. I didn't want to try to squeeze everything into this episode, so this episode was a tad bit drawn out. I hope it wasn't too boring, though. Credits! This episode was created and directed by Vikram Dev Rue, written on Google Docs, recorded on a Rodecaster Duo with a Blue Yeti microphone on a MacBook Air, M3 processor, and I mean, yeah. Oh yeah, it was also published using Spotify for broadcasters, which broadcasts it to wherever you are listening to now. Stay tuned. See you soon.